Well, hello, friends. Pastor James here again, helping to prepare us for our upcoming study of the New Testament book, 1 Peter. This is the second of three just short little videos that I am putting together. The first one focused on Peter himself, who wrote this letter. This one will be talking about the historical and political context that was in place at the time of the writing and receiving of this letter. And then the third one will be focused on the recipients themselves. In fact, in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the chosen, living as exiles dispersed abroad in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia." And so we'll talk in the third one about those 5 cities. Now, you'll notice that the letter is written to Christians, to the chosen, and it says who are exiles dispersed abroad. And this idea of Christians being scattered or dispersed, exiled, has roots in the history of the Jewish people. If you read through the Old Testament and other writings about the history of the Jews, there were a number of times where domineering nations like Babylon and Assyria, they would come and they would attack the nation of Israel. And what would happen is some of the Jews would stay and fight, many would be killed, some would be captured, and some would flee. They would scatter and they would take root in cities that were in places where these warring empires would not bother to come and try to find them. And so around the world, really, as Jesus arrived in the time of the first century, there were synagogues. In fact, if you read in the book of Acts, every time they would go to one of these cities throughout the world with the gospel, almost every time they would first go to the synagogue, and a lot of those synagogues were there because of Jews that had scattered to that spot, been exiled to that spot years and years ago. Kind of in God's sovereignty, He used that persecution to prepare cities for the gospel years and years later. And so in the time of the first century, when Peter wrote this letter, the dominant force in the world was the Roman Empire. Very, very ruthless, very powerful, massive military. And so before Jesus lived, Julius Caesar united the Roman Republic. There was all these different provinces that were part of the Roman Republic into one empire that was governed by one person and by one military and underneath one umbrella with one unit of currency and all that, called the Roman Empire. And in fact, after Caesar died, the person that replaced him kept his name. They kept being called Caesar. So he was Julius Caesar, and they'd have Caesar Augustus and Caesar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what was going on in the first century there was 2 things that were really a conflict for the early church. One was that as time went by, the Caesars wanted more and more power, and they would demand worship. When they would visit a city, they would have these massive festivals, and Caesar would be paraded down the street. You'd have to chant, "Hail Caesar." You'd have to take a knee. You'd have to bow. You'd have to, on the coin of the Roman, it would say, "King of Kings and Lord of Lords," and there'd be a picture of Caesar on there. And this was a big problem for Christians who did not believe that Caesar was anything more than a man. They believed the only King of Kings and Lord of Lords is Jesus himself. We're not going to bow down and worship. And so Christians began to be persecuted because they refused to acknowledge something that wasn't true. That Caesar, they thought, Caesar's not eternal. He's not all powerful. Only Jesus is worthy of our worship. At the same time, in the world at the time, the dominant sort of philosophical perspective came through the Greek worldview. You may be familiar with Greek mythology or the sort of Greek gods and temples. And so that was a polytheistic mindset where, there's a different god for, Apollo is the god of light and Demeter is the god of bread, and they have Zeus and they have all these different gods. And again, the Christians and also the Jews, they believed, Jesus is the light of the world. He is the bread of life. Only Jesus is worthy of our worship. And so we're not going to go to these pagan temples. We're not going to burn incense in honor of these other gods. And so a polytheistic culture was really at odds with the one God, I am the Lord your God view that is true for Jews and then Christians. The Jews, interestingly enough, prior to Jesus and in kind of that first century time, they actually had gained an exception. They were so feisty and so belligerent about not wanting to bow down to Caesar and these Greek gods that the governors who the Roman Empire sent to Israel finally just threw up their hands and said to the Caesar, let's just let them say that God is God so that we don't have to bother with them anymore. And then the Jews were like, that's fine. They made these agreements where they're like, as long as we don't have to say that these things are true, we'll pay our taxes, we'll be peaceful, that kind of thing. And as the Christian movement rose, they were so zealous for Christ. They were so zealous for just the singular focus on God and the person of Jesus Christ. It really was just not compatible with the way the world was functioning. And you could get killed. They would crucify people. They would beat people. They would imprison people. You know that maybe if you know the history from the Bible, Paul and Peter and some of the other apostles, they got thrown in prison and ended up being martyred for their faith. Most of the disciples, that's what happened to them. So that's why you have this dispersion. This area that we're going to talk about in the third video is way over on kind of the eastern part of the Roman Empire, away from the major cities. And so that was a good place for Christians to go, and they would hide. They would literally like dig holes in the ground. We'll talk about that again in the third video. But that's a little bit of kind of the political and historical context that's written into here. And so you'll see that tone massively in the letter. Peter is basically exhorting them to take courage and to remember and to stay the course and that kind of a thing. And so I think it really magnifies the importance of Peter's words, understanding kind of the context in which it was written.